Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, a podcast about people in the fintech space who are thinking through problems very clearly and are enjoying uncommon outcomes as a result of that. I'm Dr. Alice Elizabeth Wilson, founder and CEO of Uncommon, a specialist research and communication studio serving fintech clients. In each episode, I sit down with someone who I think is brilliant to steal their ideas, insights, and mental models for my own benefit, and now also for yours. Today, I'm joined by Ele Ward, who's the CMO at a London-based FinTech Ctrl Alt. So I initially reached out to you because I just learned about Ctrl Alt. I discovered that you existed, and I thought that what you were doing was super interesting, really needed, and highly original. And I think I just emailed you saying basically that. And that's how our connection began. I'd love to hand over to you, Ele, to introduce yourself in the way that feels the most interesting and relevant based on what you're working on at the minute.
So I'm Elle, I'm the CMO of Ctrl Alt. So what is Ctrl Alt? We're an infrastructure provider opening up access to alternative assets via tokenization. So what do we mean by that? Alternative assets are nothing new, but for years and years and years, they've been kind of exclusive to the most wealthy in society. So what we're about is combining financial structuring and tokenization to really break down those barriers to entry. And when we talk about kind of alternative assets, we talk about a lot of things from property to film to private equity. So we're across quite a broad range of things. And then I guess relevant for this conversation is that we're very much a new category. The conversation is evolving rapidly. So content and just messaging communication is so key to us and what we do day to day.
I think I've had the special privilege of partnering with you over the last few years and really working together on how the positioning and messaging kind of conversation has evolved over that period of time. I think there are a lot of challenges that you likely face as a result of how novel it is what you're offering. I wonder if you'd like to speak to those particular challenges and like, what is it that you find the most difficult about delivering content that works, that connects in your role?
I mean, I think content is what allows us to kind of really test where the market is. And what I mean by that is the language around the conversation. When we first started, as you know, we would never talk about tokenization or kind of blockchain. We talk about fractional investing, for example, and we were really particular about that. And the market was like at that place, right? So I think for us, that kind of adapting as the market does, and also trying to now more position ourselves as part of that leader instead of shying away from the conversation, embracing the complexity of it. So yeah, we have had a big evolution over time, and it's been interesting to see how our content has really journeyed through that and allowed us to kind of learn as well in terms of what works.
On that note about what works, are there any pieces or sort of projects that come to mind when you think about content assets that you've overseen that you think really have worked, and what was unique about them?
Well, I think, some of what we worked on with you, the more long form stuff, which is interesting, right? Because I think there'd be a lot of schools of thought that, short form is really key. But actually for us, what we were really finding, particularly kind of working with large institutions and corporates, a lot of the teams there kind of wanting to be refreshed about the space and kind of taken back to basics. And so I think a big thing for us was not presuming the kind of level of knowledge for our audience. And so these kind of long form reports that we did, for example, like the back to basics one, we need to talk about tokenization, really allowed us to speak to that. And I think the long form as well allows us to still have the short form, but it's almost about anchoring kind of one piece that can work for you, whether that's then translated into a press release. You can use all the content from that to create X amount of social posts over time. The last one we did, right, we collaborated with all those different industry experts. So that's a perfect way for us to, get some great industry names with us. They then reshare across their channels and to really kind of have some qualitative research as well. So I think that was probably our most successful. And then I guess kind of talking numbers from a sales point of view, right? A key means for us to attract prospects in terms of the data capture aspect, as opposed to, a hard sale. It's about getting people in, getting people comfortable, us really being positioned for them as a thought leader. They're ready to kind of explore our solutions now, or in the future, they understand us as the kind of go-to expert.
I think there really is something to be said for what you mentioned before about speaking to like corporate and enterprise clients and other big fintechs, investment managers, wealth managers. that there is kind of more of an expectation there to look at something like a white paper or a longer form primer rather than building trust and familiarity through shorter form pieces. I think it really highlights how that there isn't a format of content which is superior or inferior. It always has to be based on who exactly are you speaking to, what do they anticipate seeing, what do they prefer, where does their feeling of trust and security come from.
Yeah, no, completely, I would agree. And also it's about, say we're further down the line in that conversation, that said piece of content as they speak to other people on their team or whoever the kind of key stakeholder is really great evidence to help push us forward. We also do a lot of work on the design side as well, so it's never the content in isolation. It's like, how can we bring this to life and break this down as opposed to just a 20-page report is also really key, which I think helps. We're all visual people, whether we think we are or not, so I think that's really helpful too, that we combine in.
Yeah, I think that's something that Ctrl Alt has been very strong on from the beginning, a really poignant and memorable visual branding, which has been really carefully and thoughtfully carried through every asset we've worked on together.
Yeah.
Everything has been kind of design first, really, and we've worked on a bit of web copy and stuff together, haven't we? And that was all really carefully designed and blocked out according to where people's eyes are going to move and which part of the page they're going to see first and what that messaging needs to be. It's super granular from the beginning.
Yeah, no, it's really, really important. I think it's easy, especially in the space that we're in, to think we're not in the consumer space, it doesn't matter, or we should kind of play the same game as to kind of other institutions. But again, we're all visual people. And I think especially as a new startup, when we were really early on, for us, it's you're at a point where you might not necessarily have any clients to talk about or any press, when you first start out. So how can you really allow people to arrive on your site or arrive on your content and be like, yeah, these guys know what they're doing? It's about legitimacy. And I think design creates comfortability, which is key for kind of, getting people on board and engaged.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it shows a high level of effort. It shows that you genuinely care about the experience of the person who is coming to that website and you want to provide for them and take care of them. I think that's also something that especially long form content shows, because it's so much more effort. It's more expensive. It's more time consuming. It's more difficult to do. It's much more difficult to write a really cogent and engaging long form piece of content that keeps the pace up but doesn't become too conversational, but it also doesn't become too jargon ridden. You can maybe get away with it a little bit more being slightly less skilled in a shorter form piece because you have less space to make a mistake. But the long form pieces and the design together, it shows a high level of effort and commitment to excellence and to quality. And that, of course, is the power of a really well executed brand strategy, is that then transfers onto how people experience you as partners.
Yeah, for sure. I think the two go hand in hand. And I think when you're new to a market or a segment's evolving, there's a lot of visualization that's needed. What we're doing is not simple. So how can we break that down in layman terms, both in the written and the visual format, is super, super key.
I'm interested in if you want to share anything about so I know what it's like for us to work together and it's great. And we both know what we're writing about, what we're talking about. We both have expertise, skills and understanding in this area of tokenization, fractionalized investing, alternative assets. To what extent are you feeling that educational gap between yourself and your future clients or people who come into the Ctrl Alt sphere? What is their level of understanding in general? How much education are you finding you're having to provide?
Well, I think what's interesting for us as we kind of work more on our API product, right? It's okay, so the level of understanding I think is a lot more in terms of the words, in terms of the conversation. I think that's down to kind of what we see in the media, kind of big institutions now getting on board and kind of engaging with it, right? So I think that has really helped to trickle down. I think what's interesting now, the next stage for us, for example, we just announced a partnership with Live Bank that's part of Emirates MBD. And it's what does that look like for their end customers? That will be the most interesting part. Okay, we're at a very different place in terms of our B2B, but our end customer for the API for Live Bank, for example, everyday customers to an extent. And so what level of knowledge do they have, right? Obviously, it's a neobank, so similar to kind of the Revolut and the Monzo segments, there is that kind of different generation using it. So I think that's something that we're still kind of working out and tapping into will be really interesting to test out. And I think to summarize, there's such a different arrival point for our audiences. And I think that comes down to content too. There's no one size fits all, even in the B2B space, like B2B finance. It's not assumed, somebody that's on the innovation team at a bank versus like a fund manager, like very different conversation. And ways to explore language there is key.
Yeah, 100%. This is something that I encounter in my own work with my clients all the time. So much so that really I think the core of my role is translation fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's translation like between separate professional entities, but very, very often translation within those same entities. Exactly what you're speaking to there, like someone who is actively managing hedge funds. How do they talk to the people who are like onboarding new investors, and their level of understanding is going to be different, and the presumptions underpinning that can lead to all sorts of unnecessary miscommunications. But it takes somebody from the outside perspective who can understand both like pockets in this case to bridge that gap.
Yeah, for sure. I think, even for me, it's like having that top level overview is really, really key. Can be so caught up in the day to day and just constantly assume. And so, taking a step back and working with, somebody that you like that, understands that strategy and can kind of, push to be like, hey, I don't think this is quite accessible to an end reader is really, really key.
Maybe on that note, I would love to hear any reflections you have on sort of marketing, communications, PR, maybe efforts that you've seen in the industry in our sort of fintech and finance space that you think have been less effective, or mistakes that you think people make, or any sort of like, I'd be interested to know if you think there's any patterns or themes in where people can perhaps get it a little bit wrong, especially because you've been in the industry for like a bit of time now and you've been a C-level executive for a few years. I'm interested in what you've learned in that regard along the way.
Yeah, I think one thing people underestimate is the importance of in real life events, particularly, technically we're, with blockchain and stuff, we can also get categorized into the Web3 space, right? Which is so virtual, online, webinars galore. And the importance of face to face is really, really key. And also making sure that face to face, those events are creative, just because, again, it's B2B finance doesn't mean that it needs to be a kind of real sterile, suited and booted, like event round table. You can still have a round table, right? But how can it be kind of more dynamic and creative? So I think that's across the board, like creativity and face-to-face in real life events are really, really key for us bringing that forward. We make all our events as kind of interactive and as engaging as possible. Again, super design led and really, really personable. And we get such a great response from that. And then I think, again, going back to our point before, assuming that there's no kind of one size fits all, it's no kind of one and done situation. So how can you speak to as many people as possible? How can it be kind of thought leadership first as opposed to like sell? Like in the space that we're in, it's a long sales cycle, right? We're not kind of selling like a plug and play, like, I don't know, quick tech solution, like, I don't know, a calendar, right? It's a very different like buyer's cycle and journey to warm people up and get people engaged. And again, people may not know that they need us, or it may not be on their roadmap for their organization, but how can we kind of tee people up, warm them up, as opposed to having really, really sales heavy content, I think is key.
How long have you been at C-suite level for?
So at Ctrl Alt, again, I always say startups are like dog years. It's like feels like 10 years. So much happens. But yeah, probably coming up to about 3 years early next year. And then before that, I was in the climate tech space in a similar role as well, and a similar business, started off B2C and then transitioned into B2B as well, or B2B2C. So yeah.
What do you think seasoned, weather-worn dog years levels of experience Ele Ward would recommend to the Ele Ward who began this journey, particularly with Ctrl Alt 3 years ago?
I think that if you're early stage, having a generalist overview is really, really key as you start off. It's never, you're not going to have the traditional like CMO role. It's very different to an organization of 100 plus people that you're walking into. So I think being really, really kind of open-minded to that and willing to learn is what can really help. Getting creative in every sense. Like, you're not going to walk into the biggest budget and marketing and content will often come last. So how can you be creative but also show the value? I think it's very easy for people to dismiss like that side of the business and be like, oh, just whack up like a post on LinkedIn or whatever, and so I think it's also about making sure that you can advocate for yourself, like try and do the most still, but also advocating in terms of the thoughtfulness and the strategy that needs to go into things. So yeah, I think being really conscious of that. I would also say like engaging your team from the get-go. Like, for example, going back to the brand, at first, myself and the founding team, I was like, okay, I'm gonna like, do the brand and stuff. And they were like, okay, you just do it and let us know. And I was like, no, like even though my life would have been a lot easier if I'd have just done it myself, I really wanted them to be proud of what we were doing, and also like for it to speak to them. Like we almost see the brand as like this kind of personified, fictionalized character. And so that is something I would like push even further, because it allows people to engage and be excited by the brand and understand that, marketing or content, nothing's in isolation. It all flows through.
Yeah, so
So
true.
a few things, but yeah.
How much in your day-to-day role do you actually get to create content yourself, or are you sort of exclusively in a strategy and allocation role?
I mean, we're still a pretty lean team and we have to be reactive as things come in. I mean, I still really enjoy the design side, so I do quite a bit there, and the writing. So yeah, not as much as I would like. But I think it's important to still do, no matter how much time you have, to go back to that. And like sitting and writing is really, really key, because I think often sometimes as well, you can produce stuff and be like, actually, like we need a moment as the whole team to like regroup on like what our brand and messaging is, because like I'm really confused now and I'm seeing this person talk about it that way and that way. So making sure that you have the time, no matter how big your team is and how many resources you have to go and do that, I think is key.
That's a really great takeaway and an action point. And I am biased because being a writer is very core to my identity. And writing isn't just something that I do. Writing is ingrained into every part of my life, genuinely. I write to find out what I think. I write to change my mind. I write to learn, to solidify, to teach. Every activity that is, a meaningful part of my life. Writing is sort of the foundation of that activity. And it's interesting that that's something that you picked up on as well, about how it can force you to think through things in a much more defined and clear way. There is something about chaining your nebulous and disparate thoughts down into definite lines on a page or on a web browser that forces a level of consideration that isn't as easily achieved just inside your own head, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I would agree.
I wonder if you have anything to say about the role that AI has played in the last sort of 18 months in how you think about content, how you create it, how you plan it.
So again, I think it's very easy from the outsider looking in, especially when it comes to like, let's look at like the volume you should be posting, to like, oh, but just like whack it in AI, like that can be done for you. I think it's a good starting point. Like, I'm not going to lie, again, going back to my point about like a thinly stretched team or resources when you get going. Do I think it's a copy and paste and a replacement? No. But I think it can help to get started or to tidy up something, I would say. But for me, it's never going to be the bulk to drive things forward, is what I would say.
Yeah, that does, from everyone that I'm speaking to so far, that does seem to be the general consensus. And I would agree, I use it in my own workflows as well, but as a very defined tool for extremely specific areas, mostly to do with sort of outlining.
Yeah.
But the actual content itself, any professional writer will be able to tell you almost immediately if something is AI copy pasted, because it's so flat. It might be sort of technically adequate and might hit on all of the points that you want your article to cover, say, but especially for people like yourselves who are so interested in the thought leadership and the like brand story side of it. Yeah, a really useful tool, but just a tool.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing.
Okay, I would like to start closing us off by asking you my final question, which is, what do you think makes content in our industry, in the fintech and investment space, different from other kinds of content?
again, buzzword for this podcast, like I think you have to be creative. Like you really do. I think it can be a lot more challenging to kind of come up with ideas, especially when you're in a niche topic like ours, right? There's only so many times that we can break down tokenization, talk about it. So how can you make it relatable to day? How can you get creative and, piggyback off kind of key moments in times, things that are happening in the news, I would say. But I would also say on the other side is relevance is a key decision maker. Again, especially looking at a business like ours, it's a longer sales cycle. It's what builds trust and credibility. So I think is really, really key. I think in the fintech side as well, it's new, especially like both consumer and B2B, these are new products. It's, very personal, more often than not, right? You're getting people to engage with their own money, whether that's somebody allocating budget at an institution or an end customer. So the user experience in terms of from an actual like product usage point of view is super, super key and has to be thought out. And I would say it also combines a lot of things.
I think another one that comes up a lot, something that you and I particularly talk about a lot in our Google Docs comments, is the granular level of attention that has to be paid to make sure that everything is absolutely compliant at all times.
Yeah,
and sort of
no, that's a
balancing
really good point.
that with the urge to make narratively driven, rich, engaging content, but that has to also toe a very important compliance line, and trying to find the way to create content that's generally fun and interesting, useful to read, but without ever overstating anything or it's so nuanced, isn't it? So subtle how exact we have to be with making sure every word is compliant. And I do think that is a unique challenge in the space.
Yeah, for sure. It's one thing to think about that you just never would if you were working on kind of other things. And towing that very important line is super, super key and something that I think you have to quickly upskill on in this space. And it becomes second nature. Okay, no, I can't say that, so on and so on. But it's very important.
Tell me what's coming up with Ctrl Alt that you're excited about in the next sort of like 6 months.
Yeah, for sure. So we just announced our partnership with Live Bank. So essentially kind of what we're exploring there is an end customer opening up their app and being able to invest in tokenized assets via that. So again, a lot of work in terms of what does that look like? How do we communicate? Which is really, really exciting. We're doing a lot of work in the fund space as well. There's been a lot of conversation from kind of government in the UK in terms of what's the UK's role and engagement in that. So things are moving quite fast there, which is super, super exciting. And then we are also kind of growing our team and looking for kind of further expansion as well as the conversation moves. So yeah, exciting space to be in.
That sounds great. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do next, genuinely. It's been such a pleasure to work with you over these years. And yeah, I'm genuinely excited to see what you go on and do next. I know it's going to be fantastic. Thank you for joining me today for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for all you do for us as well and getting it. It's a joy to kind of work with somebody that gets where we are and can pick it up. So yeah, forever grateful.
That's kind. Thanks, Elle. See you later.
Thank you. You have a good one.
That's it for this episode of Uncommon Knowledge. I hope you learned something new or got an unfamiliar way to look at a familiar problem. Until next time, I wish you all good things, and I'll catch you on the next episode.